Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Welcome into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and this podcast should be coming to you the week of May the 4th. And everyone knows what that means. The date, May the 4th, has pretty much become the international day to commemorate and enjoy the Star Wars franchise. Obviously, this is a play on the words, may the force be with you, but it is nice that people have found a date where they can commemorate one of the most impactful, if not the most impactful, film franchise of all time. The original Star Wars really changed the game, becoming the highest grossing film to that point when it was released in 1976. And from the release of the original movie, it really laid the foundation for what we now see across all media, and that is shared universes. From the original film, this franchise has come to encompass 3 different trilogies, a couple of spin-off films, and as we are seeing now, on Disney Plus, there are a couple series all set in a galaxy far, far away. That's not even to mention all the cartoon series it spawned, and how it really reinvented the concept of movie merchandising. So, I just wanted to give a tip of the cap to the Star Wars franchise, as we are so close to May the 4th before getting into our main topics. But on this episode of the GSMC Movie Podcast, we're going to be talking about a few new releases, one starring Jason Statham, and that is Wrath of Man, which involves his character taking the job of a security guard for armored trucks. But there's a little bit more than meets the eye with him. So that will be the first film we talk about on the podcast, and then I'm going to get into this new, really strange-looking film, Mainstream, which takes a look at the concept of an internet influencer, which stars Andrew Garfield and Maya Hawke, with this film delving into the highs and the lows that come with being an internet personality. So that should definitely be interesting to take a look at. And finally, I'm going to be taking a look at the new Emilia Clarke movie, Above Suspicion, where the Mother of Dragons gets involved with a federal agent on more than one level. And as with many of Clarke's characters, chaos and destruction swiftly follow suit. So those will be the films we are talking about on this episode of the GSMC Movie Podcast, and be sure to stick around till the end of the show, as I will be re-engaging in a topic I started before the Oscars, and that is taking a look at which films on Rotten Tomatoes have the biggest disconnect in terms of their ratings between audiences and critics. So in the final segment of this episode, I'm going to be taking a look at the films that critics had much higher opinions of than audiences did. That will most certainly be a fun topic to take a look at, so be sure to stick around until the end of the show for that. But as with every episode of the GSMC Movie Podcast, I'm going to be taking a look at a film from the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. And it is rather fitting I took some time to talk about Star Wars to open the show, as this film is pretty closely related to Star Wars, and that is Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And the reason I say this film is related to Star Wars is obviously because they came out around the same time, but also because of the connection between the two directors of each film, real-life friends Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. And a little fun fact that is mentioned in the book is that George Lucas actually lost a bet between the two of them because he was under the impression that Close Encounters was going to be a bigger hit than his film Star Wars. I'm sure that he is more than happy to have lost that bet, though. And I do have to make a correction. I said Star Wars came out in 1976. It actually came out in 1977. So both these films came out the same year in what must have been a very space-themed year. And while really no film can compete with Star Wars on pretty much any level, this film, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, is notable for a couple reasons. Probably most notably is how it was Steven Spielberg's first Academy Award nomination for Best Director, which I find hard to believe, and that he was not nominated for Best Director for the work that he did on Jaws. But for all the times that he has been nominated for Best Director, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was the first film he received that honor for, and while it's nearly impossible to say that a single film is the definitive Steven Spielberg film, given that he's worked on projects such as the Indiana Jones trilogy, E.T., Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, and the upcoming West Side Story film. Not to mention all the films that he's been the executive producer of, from Back to the Future to more child-friendly content like The Land Before Time. But Close Encounters of the Third Kind really bears all the hallmarks of a quintessential Steven Spielberg film. And the movie itself revolves around Richard Dreyfuss's character, who has had an encounter with a UFO, and he is searching for an explanation as to what happened. But pretty accurate to real life, no one is willing to believe his story. Aside from one woman who is searching for her lost son, who she believes was abducted by the same aliens. The film itself is rather entertaining as it mixes sci-fi elements with a bit of a mystery. And ultimately, the film serves as one giant metaphor for man's search for meaning. So for those of you who are fans of films with a little bit of a philosophical side to them, you will definitely enjoy Close Encounters of the Third Kind. To give a few more noteworthy points about the film, it had a budget of less than $20 million, and it would go on to gross over $300 million worldwide, which pretty much cemented Spielberg as a director that could rake in the box office. And while it was going up against Star Wars in pretty much every category at that year's Academy Awards, which just so happened to be the 50th installment of that ceremony, it was able to nab Best Cinematography. And one final point that will ever have this film linked to Star Wars, the score was done by none other than the legendary John Williams. So while Close Encounters of the Third Kind was not on as grand a scale as Star Wars was, this film pretty much does the opposite and examines what it would be like when average individuals come into contact with strangers from beyond the stars. And that is what makes Close Encounters of the Third Kind a film you must see before you die. So when you have the time, take a look at this early piece of Spielberg's work. But shifting gears from an all-time classic film, I want to talk about a new release starring Jason Statham, and that is Wrath of Man. This film does have a rather interesting concept, as Jason Statham plays a man who applies for a job as a security guard for armored trucks. All of his co-workers seem to believe there's something wrong with him, and he's a bit unhinged, but we come to discover that he is simply taking this job in the hopes of encountering people that rob armored trucks for a living. This does give a little credence to the fact that his co-workers think that he is a bit unhinged, but as it turns out, he is looking for people that killed his son, which happened during a robbery gone wrong. So the film essentially is a story of revenge, which it appears there seem to be a lot of being made at the moment. As I discussed in my last podcast, Tom Clancy's Without Remorse followed a similar theme, where a badass with a gun is out for revenge against people that killed members of his family. So Jason Statham is keeping up that tradition, as well as his own tradition of portraying someone with a bunch of skills, both in hand-to-hand combat and with weapons, which he has done in pretty much every movie he has been in, from Crank to The Expendables and his work in the Fast and the Furious franchise, and of course in one of my all-time favorite terrible movies, The Meg, which I do have to admit I am super excited there's going to be a sequel for that movie. But back to the film at hand, and Jason Statham as an actor, I really do like how some actors are afraid of being typecast and essentially just playing the same character in every movie. There are actors like Jason Statham who essentially say, typecast the hell out of me. I want to play the same character in every movie, and everything I'm a part of, I want the audience walking away with this impression of me. And quite honestly, with Jason Statham, it's pretty well earned that audiences walk away with this impression that he's a person that is not to be trifled with. He is a legit martial artist, and he is either one hell of an actor when it comes to handling props, especially when they're prop guns, or he is someone who definitely knows his way around a gun in real life. And just based on the few action scenes that are included in the trailer, Wrath of Man appears to be a classic Statham film where he's kicking ass and taking names. And it really is remarkable that Statham has had the career that he's had, given that he started out in life working at a farm stand, and from there he would go on to be a competitive diver. He was so good, he in fact served on the British national team for 12 years, competing in multiple events for Great Britain, and from there he would make the transition into modeling, where he worked for such brands as The French Connection, Levi's, and Tommy Hilfiger. And somehow, through that varied path of his life, he was introduced to Guy Ritchie, who is not only the director of this film, Wrath of Man, he was the director and first person to cast Statham in a movie, which was Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. They would also work together on subsequent films Snatch and The Revolver, and they are slated to work together again on the upcoming film Five Eyes. But now here they are working on Wrath of Man together over 20 years since their first collaboration, and in an interview he gave for the film, Statham says it feels like they never stopped. He says working with Ritchie as the director is always great, and he creates this buzz on set where everyone enjoys their day's work. And a couple of their other collaborators on this film, Wrath of Man, include Scott Eastwood, who of course is the son of the legendary Clint Eastwood, but audiences may recognize him from a few of his father's films, but probably most notably he has been in Suicide Squad. Other actors in the film include Holt McCallany, who is probably best known for his starring role on the Netflix hit crime series Mindhunter, and he was also in Fight Club way back in the day. Also in the film is actor Jeffrey Donovan, who apparently has made a career out of playing the Kennedy brothers on screen, as he played Robert Kennedy in, funnily enough, Clint Eastwood's J. Edgar, and he played JFK in the biopic about Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. Also in the film is Josh Hartnett, and for those of you who don't know, he is the other guy in Pearl Harbor, opposite Ben Affleck, and rounding out the main cast is veteran actor Andy Garcia, who of course rose to fame for his captivating portrayal in the otherwise questionable Godfather 3. And in this film, he plays a character simply referred to as the King. So I can only assume that during the course of this film, he is going to be the main target on Jason Statham's poop list. So for all of you who are interested in viewing the new film, Wrath of Man, it is going to be released in theaters starting May 7th. The film is, of course, rated R due to its graphic violence, so viewer discretion is advised. But for all of you in the mood for a good old-fashioned action flick, be sure to check out Wrath of Man. Right now, however, I am going to be taking a quick break on the GSMC movie podcast, but be sure to stick around because coming up in the next segment, I once again will be delivering the box office report, and hopefully this will be the last week where I'm talking about a pretty stagnant movie landscape. For the first time in what feels like a really long time, this week we are going to see a lot of new releases hitting theaters. So hopefully that will shake things up at the box office and draw in a diverse array of audiences. Because for the past couple weeks, it's really just been me reporting on Godzilla vs. Kong and how that film is really just a runaway at the box office. Essentially, it's that film and everybody else, which gets me wondering maybe I should be taking into account the worldwide box office. Because as I touched on in the last box office report, the highest grossing film of the year, which has grossed over $800 million, is a Chinese film called Hi Mom, which essentially is just the plot of Back to the Future from a female perspective. Yet, that film has been able to rake in almost $1 billion without even being released outside of the Asian market. And yes, restrictions regarding movie theaters are much more lenient overseas as opposed to how they are here. Nevertheless, with a film being able to gross that amount of money without any contributions from the US market says something. But returning from my tangent and getting back to the point, next segment I will be talking about the box office report. Then I'll be talking about the new film Mainstream, which takes aim at internet personalities and the whole concept of being an online influencer. The film stars Andrew Garfield and Maya Hawke, and for those wondering, I'll just answer it now. Yes, she is the daughter of Ethan Hawke. She is also the daughter of Uma Thurman. But this film she is in, Mainstream, tackles a very interesting subject matter, so it'll be fun to take a look at. And be sure to stick around until the end of the show, as I am going to be continuing on the topic of films on Rotten Tomatoes that have the largest disconnect in terms of ratings between critics and audiences. I already covered the films that audiences looked on much more favorable than critics, so this time around I'll be taking a look at the other side of the coin. Not only are there a bunch of interesting films on this list, but there are a lot of interesting disparities as well. So stick around, all that and more is coming up on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
And welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and in the last segment, I just finished talking about the new Guy Ritchie film, Wrath of Man, where Jason Statham stars as a man who takes a job as a security guard for armored trucks. All of his new coworkers consider him to be crazy because he seems to be looking forward to the position, and the rest of them see their job as they are the prey, and they are simply waiting for the predators to set upon them. But here's the twist, he is actually hoping to be set upon by people that rob those vehicles for a living. The reason for this is because a gang killed his son in a robbery gone wrong when he was simply an innocent bystander. So this event set Statham on the path for revenge, and it seems to carry the hallmarks of a classic Jason Statham and Guy Ritchie film, with this being the fourth time they have collaborated together. The film stars Andy Garcia as well as Scott Eastwood and is set for release in theaters starting May 7th. The film is rated R, so viewer discretion is advised. But if you are a fan of the action thriller, definitely check out Wrath of Man. Another film set for release on May 7th is the film Mainstream, which will be the main feature I am talking about in this segment. This film stars Andrew Garfield and Maya Hawke, and it explores the concept of internet personalities and sort of pulls back the curtain on the concept of a celebrity influencer. Or I should probably say an influencer who becomes a celebrity. The subject matter behind this film seems like it's really interesting, so it'll be fun to pick apart, as I'm of a generation where celebrities were known for doing a thing, like how being famous usually required someone to be an actor, a musician, or a professional athlete. Now all it really takes to be famous is a camera phone and a lot of free time. So that should be a fun topic to look at on all fronts. What also will probably be a fun topic is in our final segment, I'm going to be taking a look at the films on Rotten Tomatoes that have the largest disparity when it comes to ratings between audiences and critics. And in that segment, I'll be taking a look at the films that critics looked on a lot more favorably than the audiences. So be sure to stick around until the end of the show for that. But right now, I'm going to bring another installment of the box office report. And for the first time in a long time, I can say that I'm genuinely surprised to see what movie is at the top of the box office. Taking home the crown this week is a film that I was not even aware of. I vaguely recall seeing it on the slate of new releases and thought it wasn't even worth mentioning, but the film is Demon Slayer, Mugen Train, and it tells the story of Tanjiro Commando, who, after his family was brutally murdered and his sister turned into a demon, he is set on the path to become a demon slayer. So him and his friends board the Mugen Train. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. But nonetheless, they board this train and are on quote-unquote a path to despair. Demon Slayer, as I'll refer to it from here on out, has debuted worldwide, and it has raked in almost $430 million, with over $27 million of that coming from the U.S. market. I'm not really sure what to make of this being at the top of the domestic box office, other than clearly there is a large audience and demand for anime films, and they are willing to go to theaters to experience the content that they enjoy. But I really do have to just stress how crazy I find this box office total, as in 1 week it has made more money worldwide than Godzilla vs. Kong has during its entire theatrical run. And I know that Godzilla vs. Kong was also released via streaming on HBO Max. Nevertheless, for a film like Demon Slayer to come out of nowhere and snatch the top spot at the US box office is a very impressive feat. So we'll call that a bit of an upset, but a film that was anticipated to do very well at the box office, that was the new Mortal Kombat reboot. That film raked in over $23 million. And again, you have to factor in that this film was also one that was simultaneously released on HBO Max. So, if it was to get the traditional theatrical release treatment, who knows how much it could have raked in. But, unlike the number 1 film at the box office, the number 2 film at the box office did not perform well in the international market, which when you consider this is a film based around essentially a martial arts tournament, you would think that that would be appealing to audiences overseas. But to date, Mortal Kombat has made less money internationally than it has at the domestic box office. The takeaway I glean from that is that this movie is really just for people that had the video game in the 90s. But those individuals did show up in force for this film's opening, which contributed to it being number 2 at the box office. Coming in at number 3 is the Bob Odenkirk film Nobody, which is still putting up respectable box office totals, given that it's been released not only during the pandemic, but during the month of April, which is usually a tough time for a film to make its debut in theaters. But last week brought Nobody's running total above $22 million, so good for everyone involved in making that film. Coming in at number 4 at the box office is a film that has been in theaters for a while, and I am guessing will be in theaters for a while, given the trend that Disney has set for its theatrical releases during the pandemic, and that is Raya and the Last Dragon. It made over $2 million at the box office last week, and I really just wonder how many of the people going to see this film are people that have seen it on Disney Plus and really just want to experience the breathtaking visuals on the big screen. But Raya and the Last Dragon is in its 8th week of its theatrical run, and I have to imagine that Disney will keep it in there as long as it's financially feasible, because it seems they are going to try and glean every last drop of box office potential out of their productions. But who can really blame them? Go ahead, Disney, and get that money. Which brings us to our final film on the box office report that was able to gross over $1 million domestically last week, and that was the horror film The Unholy. When this film was coming out and I was selecting films to talk about on that week of the podcast, I took a look at this film and was like, this is going to be nothing but a run-of-the-mill horror flick with not really much going for it. But as I am sure was their goal all along, the makers of The Unholy were able to stick it in my face. So congratulations to The Unholy for being in the top 5 of box office earnings every week of its theatrical run. And one more more film I will mention, mostly because I spoke about it last week on the podcast, and that is the film Together Together. This is an independent film starring Ed Helms and Patty Harrison, where Ed Helms plays someone who is looking to have a child, and Harrison is essentially a woman who rented out her uterus for him to do so. She plays his surrogate, and this film seemed to have a lot of complexities to it, and it was able to draw just over $700,000 in its debut week, which is good enough for sixth in terms of box office earnings. But that will do it for this installment of the Box Office Report, and moving forward, these should get very, very interesting, as there's a whole slate of new films coming out, and in greater numbers than they have been up to this point, and we are inching closer and closer to blockbuster season. So it will be interesting to take a look at the box office as more and more high-profile films come out, and the theater industry slowly but surely gets back on its feet. And shifting gears to a film that I think is going to help the theater industry get back on its feet is the movie Mainstream. As I stated earlier, this film stars Andrew Garfield and Emma Hawke, who is the daughter of Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman, which is not the only quote-unquote Hollywood legacy involvement in this film, with it being directed by Gia Coppola, who is the granddaughter of Francis Ford Coppola. And before I get into the film, I just find it a little ironic that people involved in making this film are those that essentially inherited fame coming from famous families. And this film is essentially about people that achieve fame by essentially just recording themselves and pretending that their life is so much glamorous than it is. Nevertheless, it will be interesting to see a film that takes aim at this topic. The film is not only going to be about internet influencers, but is actually going to have internet influencers in it. Jake Paul, for instance, will be a part of the film, and him and his brother are probably best known now as the people that get involved in boxing matches and pretty much draw a lot of money because people want to see them get their ass kicked, which I do have to say is not a bad career strategy. But back to the film Mainstream. Maya Hawke's character starts making YouTube videos with Andrew Garfield's character, who is a bit of an established internet personality, and from there she begins to see all the highs and lows that go along with being an internet personality. And going beyond simply being an internet personality, I'm really interested to see how this film just portrays the idea of being famous in general. From the trailer and what I've read about it, the film seems to be playing off the dichotomy of outwardly portraying a personality that lives an incredibly glamorous lifestyle that everyone else who's watching you should be jealous of, whereas in reality those people are struggling with serious issues as it pertains to their self-identity. So that aspect of the film should be very compelling to watch, and I have to say I'm really just interested in the take they have on internet stardom in general. I think in a lot of ways it is great that mass media is so accessible to everybody. It provides opportunities to people that they would not have been afforded in the past. I am saying that as someone who is producing a podcast. Yet, on the other hand, I think that this access to mass media has really exposed just the mental illness people have in terms of needing attention. To give an example of what I'm talking about, I was recently in an airport and I'm walking through the terminal to my gate. I see this person dancing. They're dressed like a slob and pretty much have no awareness of what's going on around them. And she's doing this right in front of a gate. So after a few moments of just looking at what a fool she's making of herself, I see that she's recording a TikTok video and her phone is propped up against the podium where flight attendants check people into a flight. And I can understand to a degree if someone just has the need to dance in public. But when that crosses over to the point where it's like, I have to record this because people are going to want to see this, I really do believe that is a type of a mental illness. And I really don't know what's worse. Whether there are these people that have the need to just capture every moment of their life and share it on platforms where other people are going to view it, or that there are hordes of audiences that are going to consume that content. And I know some people listening are going to say, you're being a hypocrite, you're a person that does a podcast about movies. So what's the difference between that type of content and this type of content? They're both ways that people are entertained, and while there may be some truth to that, the best way I can describe it, content like a film or a TV show is like going to see a stand-up comedian. You are going to see a professional that has put a lot of work into their craft and has exuded a lot of effort, all in an attempt to make you laugh. And content like people dancing on TikTok is like if when you're driving home from that, you see two dogs having sex on the side of the road. That is something that can also make you laugh, but you are laughing at it because it is something abnormal and not likely to see very often, but the more you see it, the more the law of diminishing returns comes into play. So while there are audiences for this type of content that is essentially seeing two dogs having sex on the side of the road, in terms of its entertainment value, there is not much to it, and the more you see it, the less interesting it becomes. So, while I think the film Mainstream will have a more elegant way of describing the differences between traditional forms of media and this new type of internet fame, I'm sure there will be some commentary on how the content generated by internet influencers is just pandering to the lowest common denominator. So, we will have to wait and see what Mainstream is going to say about this. But for those interested in viewing the film, it will debut in theaters starting Friday, May 7th. And in addition to starring Andrew Garfield and Maya Hawke, the film also includes Johnny Knoxville and Jason Schwartzman, which kind of makes the film a Coppola family reunion, as he is the nephew of Francis Ford Coppola. So be sure to check out Mainstream. But I'm going to be taking a quick break here on the GSMC Movie Podcast, but don't go anywhere, as coming up, I will be talking about the new Emilia Clarke film, Above Suspicion, where she plays someone who gets involved with a federal agent on more than one level in a new suspense thriller. So be sure to stick around for that, and I will also be giving you another installment of the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report, and there was quite a bit of breaking news in the film industry this week, so you're not going to want to miss it. And be sure to stick around until the end of the show, as I'm going to be taking a look at the films on Rotten Tomatoes that have the biggest disparity when it comes to how they were rated by the critics and by the audiences. In that segment, I will be taking a look at the films that critics seem to enjoy more than the general public and speculating as to why. And to give you a little preview of that segment, Star Wars: The Last Jedi is on that list. It had a critical rating of 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, and I have no issue speculating as to why its rating was that high from the critics. I believe that the rumors surrounding Disney paying off critics to give its films favorable reviews are definitely true, and this rating is simply an example of that because The Last Jedi flat out sucked. So, we will be getting into all that and more on the GSMC Movie Podcast, so don't go anywhere.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
welcome back into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rich McDonough, and on my last segment, I finished talking about the new film Mainstream. This film is slated for release in theaters starting May 7th. It stars Andrew Garfield and Maya Hawke as two people that tackle the world and experience the highs and lows of being an influencer. Or I guess saying internet personality is more of an accurate moniker for their characters. But this film does tackle the idea of what it's like to be internet famous, and their two characters are different depictions of what that life does to you. The film is directed by Gia Coppola, who is the granddaughter of Francis Ford Coppola. The film also stars his nephew, Jason Schwartzman, as well as Johnny Knoxville. So for all of you out there who are looking for a film that dramatizes the perverse life of an online personality, take a look at Mainstream, which once again will hit theaters starting Friday, May 7th. And another film that is slated to come out on May 7th is the feature film of this segment, which is the new Emilia Clarke film, Above Suspicion, which is based on true events, where Clarke plays a young woman who is looking to escape her life that is very much messed up due to her involvement in criminal activity as well as drug use. And her character believes that the best way out of this life is by getting involved with a young FBI agent played by Jack Huston, who is probably best known for his involvement in the TV series Fargo. And she gets involved with him on multiple levels, both by helping him in an investigation that he is a part of, by supplying him with information, but they also get involved romantically. And this is a bit of a problem, considering Huston's character has a wife and two kids. So from there on, the relationship gets a little complicated. So that shall be a fun premise to dissect in this segment, and be sure to stick around until our next segment, as I'll be taking a look at films on Rotten Tomatoes that have the biggest gap in terms of ratings by critics and audiences. And I will be taking a look at the films that critics seem to enjoy a lot more than the general public. So that topic should be a lot of fun. Be sure to stick around until the end of the show. But right now, I want to bring another installment of the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report. And there has been a lot of breaking news since our last episode when it comes to the film industry. And one of the biggest pieces of news, I think, has to be the announcement that in the next Superman film, the Son of Krypton will be played by an African American for the first time in a film adaptation. This news is obviously significant because up until this point, everyone who has portrayed the Big Blue Boy Scout has pretty much matched the appearance from the original comic book. I think it is interesting that they are doing something so radically different, and I'm sure there will be people that are not fans of this choice, but at the end of the day, if it's a quality film, what's the difference? And a little more details on the film itself. It is supposed to be produced by J.J. Abrams, as well as Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it has been stated that this film is going to exist outside of the continuity of the DCEU, which I have to say really doesn't mean much, considering the very idea of the DCEU is pretty much dead. Ray Fisher has come out and confirmed that he is no longer playing Cyborg. Robert Pattinson has taken the mantle of Batman from Ben Affleck, and God only knows where the other characters from the DCEU stand. We know Flash is going to be getting a standalone film, and he will still be played by Ezra Miller. The standalone Black Adam movie starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is currently filming, and there is also supposed to be another Shazam movie made. But in terms of how all these movies fit together now, who really knows? But it has been confirmed in this standalone Superman film, he will be portrayed by a black actor for the first time in history. So if nothing else, it should be a fresh take on a classic character. Other than that, there's not much information out about this film, as it is still in the early stages of development. But it should be interesting to watch this saga unfold. And staying on the topic of superhero films, as that again is the most popular thing going in the world right now, Marvel Studios released this trailer hype video hybrid type thing with voiceover by the late Stan Lee, where this piece of content included clips from past Marvel films as well as those yet to be released, and pretty much gave everyone the release schedule for all Phase 4 films. which are as follows. The standalone Black Widow film, which was supposed to come out this week originally, has been pushed back to July 9th. Then later in the year, we will see Shang-Chi, Legend of the Ten Rings, on September 23rd. After that, we will see 2 Marvel films release in 2 back-to-back months, with Chloe Zhao's The Eternals debuting in theaters November 5th. And Spider-Man No Way Home, hitting theaters just before Christmas, December 17th. The next film after that will be coming out pretty much exactly a year from now, and that is Thor, Love and Thunder, set for release on May 6th, 2022. And I do apologize, I skipped over one, which is Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, which will finally be released March 25th. 2022, after being pushed all the way back from its original release date of November 6th, 2020. Later on in 2022, we will see the sequel to Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, which is scheduled to hit theaters July 8th, 2022, and it will be interesting to see how that film does, given that it has lost its face of the franchise in Chadwick Boseman. But later on in that year, we will be getting the Captain Marvel follow-up, The Marvels, which probably has the best release date of any of these films, coming out 11/11/22, as it will be released on November 11th of next year. Moving on to 2023, we will see the 3rd installment of the Ant-Man franchise, which is titled Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which I have to assume will be the final installment of that franchise, but you can never say never when it comes to a Marvel franchise. But wrapping up Phase 4 will be the 3rd installment of the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise, which will be released May 5th, 2023. So, there you have it, MCU Phase 4. This interconnected universe that has already churned out over 20 movies shows no signs of slowing down. And I'm sure it will not be long before we are hearing news about Phase 5, because the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the true never-ending story. But moving on to another piece of film industry news, this is in regard to streaming, and it's a pretty significant announcement. Paramount Plus has announced that they are planning on debuting a new movie every single week in 2022. CEO Bob Backus announced that this is part of their Mountains of Movies campaign, and this whole concept is going to involve them releasing Paramount Plus originals, as well as offerings from other studios under the Paramount banner. Now, on the surface, this is clearly an attempt to up their subscribers and get more eyes on the recently rebranded platform. But on a larger scale, this gets into the whole idea of what is going to be the future of movie theaters. As streaming grows in popularity and it makes more and more fiscal sense for studios to simply release their content onto the platform directly, without even having these movies have a theatrical run, it really does raise a lot of questions, not only for the theater industry, but for the movie industry as a whole. What changes are going to be made to how films are monetized? Actors, producers, directors all used to have tie-ins with their compensation based off of box office bonuses, essentially just how much money it makes at the box office. How is that going to change when these films are being released onto streaming platforms that already have an audience and subscribers? We are already seeing this to a degree with films making simultaneous debuts in theaters and on streaming platforms during the pandemic. But what is going to happen to the film industry when that method is no longer a band-aid on a problem and that's just the new way of doing things? Either way, Paramount's idea of releasing a quote-unquote mountain of movies with a new film debuting on their platform every single week in 2022, that will not only raise a ton of questions for the film industry as a whole, but it will also cause other streaming platforms to react in kind. As we all know, Netflix curates its own content, which goes directly to its platform, but seeing how other streaming platforms like HBO Max, for example, which is owned by Warner Brothers, react to this new way of doing business will be interesting to see. But I have gone on a bit long and I do want to get to other topics in this segment, so that will pretty much do it for this installment of the GSMC Movie Podcast News Report. But don't worry, each and every episode I'm going to be reporting on the latest and the most interesting news stories there are in the film industry. Right now, however, I do want to shift gears into talking about the new film, which is based on true events, and that is Above Suspicion. which stars Emilia Clarke, and as I'm sure everybody listening to this podcast is aware, she played Daenerys Targaryen on the HBO series Game of Thrones. And while that role was part of a fantasy epic, and this one is grounded in gritty realism, her characters do seem to share the similarity of bringing chaos and destruction wherever they go. And I do have to say, just from watching the trailer and listening to her accent that she is putting on for this role, it does sound a little ridiculous. The movie is set in a rural Kentucky mining town, so she does have a very thick southern accent, but it just really sounds like someone who's trying to make fun of someone from the South, and I have to say I'm not that surprised because despite her really achieving icon status, Emilia Clarke is not that great of an actress. I often felt that she was the low point when it came to acting on that show that otherwise had immensely talented actors that played their roles to perfection. But not to be overly critical, I have to give it to her. She did work through a very life-threatening injury when working on Game of Thrones as she suffered brain aneurysm. Yet despite that, didn't let anyone know about it, didn't let it affect her work in any way, so I have to give her props for that. And despite what I think of her acting, this film does seem like it's a very compelling, suspenseful thriller. And starring opposite Clarke is Jack Huston, who has been in films such as American Hustle, as well as the remake of Ben-Hur, but is probably best known for his involvement in the series Fargo. He is the FBI agent that uses Emilia Clarke's character for information. Once he has it, he ends up using her for a little bit more, despite the fact that he has a wife and 2 kids. So, this immoral FBI agent gets a little bit more than he bargained for, which you should probably anticipate when you get involved with a criminal drug user that is pretty much doing anything to escape the life she currently has. So, there were a few red flags, and I know that you need drama to tell a story and make a movie, but this is based off real events, which really just does make this whole premise all the more unbelievable. So if you are in for a film where the characters are put in precarious situations and have you guessing at every turn, I recommend you check out Above Suspicion. This film is set for release in theaters on Friday, May 7th, and will be released on video on demand the following week on the 14th. And one aspect of this film that is a little hard to believe is that it made its debut all the way back in 2019. It did make an appearance at a film festival and was set to be released in theaters in 2020, but as we all know, something got in the way. But here we are all these years later, and it is finally getting its chance at the theaters. So once again, if you are interested in checking out the new film Above Suspicion, you can see it in theaters starting May 7th. But right now I'm going to take a little break on the GSMC movie podcast, but you're going to want to stick around until the end of the show, as in the next segment I will be getting into the films on Rotten Tomatoes that have the biggest disconnect when it comes to ratings from both the audience and the critics. I did one set of these 10 films on an episode a few weeks ago before the Oscars, where I took a look at the films that critics rated more harshly than audiences, and in this segment I'm going to be doing the opposite. I'm going to be taking a look at films that, for whatever reasons, audiences just either didn't connect with, or simply just didn't enjoy them as much as the critics did. And there is a lot that separates the opinion of a critic and the average moviegoer, as the average moviegoer is really just looking for an experience that is enjoyable and entertaining. And on the other hand, a critic is essentially going into a film with a checklist of things to look for. And in order for a critic to consider a film good, it really has to satisfy a lot of preconceived notions. So as we will see in the next segment, it is very hard for critics to see eye to eye on a film. In fact, it is pretty much impossible to do so. But one exception to that rule was, believe it or not, the film Paddington 2. When that film first came out in theaters in 2007, it enjoyed the longest period of time where a film on Rotten Tomatoes had both 100 from the critics and the audience. Now, over time, that has changed. It now has an audience rating score of 87%, which is still incredibly high for Rotten Tomatoes. But probably the most surprising thing about that movie is it still has a 100% rating from the critics. And for those of you wondering if you have this film confused with something else, nope, it's the film about a teddy bear with a raincoat and a little red hat That film is rated higher than The Godfather and Citizen Kane. So there's no perfect formula for what critics are looking for when they go to the movies, but we're going to take a look at that in our next segment where we look at the films that have the biggest disparity on Rotten Tomatoes when it comes to ratings between the audiences and the critics. So stick around and we will be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome to the fourth and final segment of the GSMC movie podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Rich McDonough, and in my last segment, I just finished talking about the new Emilia Clarke film, which I guess isn't really new, considering it came out in 2019, but is only now making its way to theaters, so it's new to us. But anyway, in this film, she plays a character from a rural Kentucky mining town, who is not only caught up in drugs, but some good old-fashioned criminal activity to go along with that. But this character is looking to make a clean break in her life and get away from those things, and the best way she sees of accomplishing this goal is getting involved with an FBI agent in order to provide him with information, but this goes a step further as they become engaged romantically. This is a bit of a problem, however, as the FBI agent is married with 2 kids. And to top it all off, this movie is based off true events. So if you are a fan of Emilia Clarke or just looking for a new suspenseful thriller, be sure to check out Above Suspicion, which will be released in theaters Friday, May 7th, and will be released via video on demand the following week on May 14th. And I will let you draw your own conclusions on the film, but of the 26 critics that have reviewed it on Rotten Tomatoes, they have deemed it a 32% in terms of an approval rating, which transitions us into the topic of this final segment, which is taking a look at the films on Rotten Tomatoes that have the largest gaps in terms of rating. And this list will be made up of 10 films that critics rated much higher than the audiences did, which I feel is very on brand for the concept of a critic, as they are people that go into films with the belief, and in some cases it is actually true, where they know more about the criteria that makes a film good, as many of them believe that their palate is much more refined than the average moviegoer. There can be arguments made for and against that point of view, but the bottom line is that audiences and critics rarely ever see eye to eye on something. Where critics place more emphasis on the subtleties of filmmaking, such as pacing and cinematography, the average audience member is just looking to be entertained and are not going into a film with a scorecard making sure that it checks off a certain amount of boxes. But nonetheless, in this segment, we are going to take a look at the films that checked off those boxes for the critics, but ultimately, audiences just didn't feel the same way about them. So, without further ado, we will get into the list, starting with number 10. The film is Foxcatcher, which received an 87% rating from the critics, but only a 66% from the audience, making the difference a margin of 21%. And some films, it may be hard to understand why it receives certain ratings from different groups. This one, I think it's as simple as audience members were going into a Steve Carell movie, hoping to see at least a little bit of his trademark comedic ability. But for anyone who has seen Foxcatcher, you know that this is probably the biggest departure Steve Carell has made in his career from his traditional traditional buffoonish self when it comes to the characters he plays on screen. In Foxcatcher, he plays the deranged John DuPont, and the film was based off the real-life events that happened at the Foxcatcher Ranch in the 90s, which at that time was used as a training facility for the U.S. men's Olympic wrestling team. Steve Carell really stretches his range as an actor in this one, and really plays a disturbing character. So for all those audience members that were hoping to see something in the vein of Michael Scott, I'm guessing they were very disappointed, and that may have resulted in the film Foxcatcher receiving a much lower review from audiences than critics. Moving on to the number 9 film on this list, it is Contagion, which has a gap of 22%, with the critics rating it with an 85% approval rating, and the critics only giving it a 63% approval rating with a gap of 22%. Now with this film, maybe the critics just recognized it as prophetic, given that the plot of this 2011 film is about a new airborne pathogen being released, and everything pretty much grinding to a halt as the CDC looks for a cure. I guess 2020 decided to steal the plot of that movie. But with the much lower reviews from audiences, I think you can kind of explain that as this being a film starring Matt Damon, when he was really in the thick of his action thriller movie days, such as the Bourne series as well as Green Zone. And a film billed as Matt Damon versus an airborne pathogen could have given audience members the idea that this was more of an action-based movie as opposed to a serious drama. But whatever the reasons are, Contagion makes the list of films that critics enjoyed a lot more than audiences. But moving on to the next film on this list, it is also a film that has a disparity of 22% between audiences and critics. The critics gave it a very high rating of 94%, while the audience reviews only came to a 72% approval rating, and that is the film Snowpiercer. Having just watched this film again recently, I have no idea why the audiences ranked it so low. It has a great premise, it has fleshed out characters, gets you emotionally invested as to what's happening on screen. The film stars Chris Evans, so what more could you really want out of a film? And it's even more mind-boggling that audiences ranked it so much lower than critics, as there is now a spin-off TV series, also called Snowpiercer, which stars Sean Bean. So, with Snowpiercer being rated so much lower by audience members than critics, I guess I have to chalk one up for critics knowing more about what makes a quality film, and maybe just write this off to audiences not understanding the film. But whatever the reason for the gap, Snowpiercer comes in at number 8, and coming in at number 7 is the 2012 film The Master, which stars Joaquin Phoenix, Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Amy Adams. This film is about a World War II veteran played by Phoenix, who finds it difficult to adjust to life following the war, so he ends up joining a cult, as we all do from time to time. But this film has received a critical rating of 84% on Rotten Tomatoes, while it has received an audience average approval rating of only 61%, with a gap of 23%. And I have to be honest, I have not seen The Master, so I can't really speak as to why there's this much of a disparity between audiences and critics. But if I had to guess, just based on the actors involved in the film, Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman have been, and in Hoffman's case, was known for their layered character work. So for those critics that get all hot and bothered for an actor really inhabiting their role, it is easy to see why they gave this film such positive reviews, whereas audiences that are really looking to be entertained don't really appreciate the subtleties that go into performances like that. But that is all speculation on my part, as again, I have not seen The Master, and another film I have not seen on this list is The Tree of Life, which comes in at number 6 on this list, having received an average critical rating of 84% and an average audience rating of 60%, which for those keeping score at home is a difference of 24%. And when you stop and take a look at the film, it has a pretty great cast with Brad Pitt, Sean Penn, Christian Chastain, and Ty Sheridan in his debut film role. But while I have not seen the film, I do remember the promos for it when it was coming out, and I just thought to myself, this is the most Oscar-y, baitiest film I think I've ever seen. So this film may have been a victim of its own message, where it was very heavy-handed, which I feel like isn't very hard to do when you're story is literally about the meaning of life. So while critics may have found this story engaging and insightful, audiences may have just taken a look at the Tree of Life and deemed it to be just Hollywood pablum. Again, it is hard for me to give a real definitive answer as to why there's such a big gap in terms of the reviews, because I have not seen the Tree of Life, and that is an issue that will continue with other films on this list, including the next one, number 5, which is Ghostbusters. And for clarification, for those of you who think I must have said something wrong, this is the 2016 version, which has the same title as the original. Now, this film is just really difficult to talk about in a lot of ways, but I'll give you the raw numbers first before I get into that. It received a critical rating of 74% on Rotten Tomatoes, with a 49% rating from audiences, with a gap of 25%. But I do have to say it's pretty obvious as to why the audience rating is so low. There was a very vocal community in the build-up to this film being made that were just against the idea of there being a Ghostbusters movie with an all-female cast. That is rather ridiculous, given that filmmakers are trying to do things to make things fresh, while at the same time knowing that their best bet financially is to attach themselves to a pre-existing intellectual property, and that's how we get movies like the 2016 Ghostbusters. So I'm not really sure what stock can be put into either of these ratings when you consider all the quote-unquote controversy about the film in the first place. But moving on to number 4 on this list, it is the Sam Raimi film Drag Me to Hell, which somehow has a critical rating of 93%, as opposed to an audience rating of 62%. And this is one I really don't want to spend a lot of time on, as it really just seems like a generic horror film. And when it comes down to it, really who's to say what makes one good and one bad? In fairness, I probably have to see the film to make that kind of judgment, but the overall premise is there's supernatural spirits plaguing regular people, and as a result, some of them die. So it scores a 0 for originality, but who knows, maybe the director of the original Spider-Man films found a way to make that premise fresh and exciting. But moving on to number 3, which is a film I have seen, and that is Captain Marvel. This film was significant because it was the MCU's first female-led film, and it really isn't rated that highly by critics or by the audiences. The critics gave it a 79% on Rotten Tomatoes, and the audience gave it a 45%, giving it a gap of 34%. And in terms of why this film didn't receive that much acclaim, I think it has something to do with the fact that the superhero origin story is just so played out and contrived at this point. That type of movie just isn't really engaging, and building off of that, the main character is all-powerful. So what conflict is really being built throughout the film? There's no real tension in the film, and no doubt that she's going to come out victorious, so there isn't that much to keep the audience riveted. But moving on to the second film on this list, and the penultimate film, is the 2014 movie Noah, starring Russell Crowe as the Noah from the Bible. This film scored a 76% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes from the critics, but a mere 41% from audiences, with a difference of 35%. And with this film, I really just think it comes down to the fact that, again, this is a story that everyone is familiar with. They know the ending. It is a tale from the gosh darn Bible, so the word has been out on how it ends for around 2,000 years. So the only real motivation to see it is to observe how it was adapted to a film. And if you were hoping for compelling twists from the story of Noah, I really don't know what to tell you. But moving on to our number one film that critics enjoyed much more than audiences, and that is Star Wars: The Last Jedi. Critics gave this a preposterous rating of 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, while much more accurately, the audiences ranked it at a 42%. That is a whopping difference of 48%, and that is by far the biggest gap on this list. And I alluded to this a little bit in an earlier segment. I really just think that Disney was paying off critics at this time. Either that, or critics just liked how this film departed from how The Force Awakens was essentially just a remake of the original Star Wars. But just because a film does things that are different doesn't make it good, because The Last Jedi absolutely sucked. Say what you want about The Force Awakens just copying the original format of the first Star Wars film, it was still a good movie that got you interested in the characters that were introduced and the story that was being told, whereas The Last Jedi took those new characters that you were engaged in and sent their character arcs astray and introduced a bunch of characters that weren't interesting and overall weren't necessary to the plot. Aside from the action scene at the end of the film that involved Luke Skywalker, there were not a lot of memorable moments from this film, so I completely understand why the audiences ranked it as low as they did, and really have to give some credence to those rumors that Disney pays off critics to rate their films highly. But whatever the reasons are that cause the big disconnect between audiences and critics and their opinions of films, I'm sure that it is going to be an eternal struggle, but at least it's fun to take a look at the disconnect between the two groups and speculate on the possible reasons as to why there's such a disparity in the first place. But that will pretty much do it for this episode of the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I do want to thank everyone who is listening to the podcast. It really means a lot. And I do want to encourage anyone who has not subscribed to this podcast to do so, as you will be notified every time a new episode drops. Also, if you could write us a nice review, those really help us a lot. And be sure to engage with us on our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. That will do it for this episode. I've been your host, Rich McDonough, and I will see you next time on the GSMC Movie Podcast.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.